The farmer floods his own field on purpose. He walls the water in behind a low bank of dirt, lets the river bury his crop ground under 4 feet of brown, silt-heavy water, and then he walks away. He won't touch it for 6 weeks. No fertilizer. No fallow year. And the soil he comes back to will grow a full crop, then do it again the next year, and the year after that, without ever wearing out. This worked for 5,000 years, longer than any empire, any religion, any pharaoh or sultan or king who ever sat on top of it. The system outlived all of them. And then, inside the span of about 2 human lifetimes, we ripped it out by the roots. And the people who had farmed that mud for 50 centuries suddenly started dying of a disease their ancestors had somehow kept in check. That's the part that doesn't make it into the textbooks. We didn't abandon this system because it failed. We didn't replace it because something better came along. We killed it on purpose. For one specific reason, to make one specific man rich. And the bill for that decision is still being paid today by more than 100 million people who have no idea their grandparents were sold out. So let's start with the thing itself, because once you see how it actually worked, the question isn't, why did we stop? And becomes something much worse. How did we let them talk us into it? Picture the Nile Valley not as a river, but as a long green ribbon of life threaded through one of the driest deserts on Earth. Step 100 yards off the bank and you're in sand that hasn't seen rain in years. The only reason anything grows at all is that once a year, like clockwork, the river swells up and drowns the land on either side of it. For a few weeks in late summer, the Nile stops being a river and becomes an inland sea. Most civilizations would have run from that flood. The Egyptians built their entire world around catching it. Here's the mechanism, and it is almost insultingly simple. They divided the floodplain into enormous fields, basins, each one ringed by earthen walls. Long, low dikes of packed dirt, running for miles, breaking the valley into a grid of shallow holding pens. When the flood arrived, they opened channels and let the water pour in. Then they closed the gaps and trapped it. The water sat there still and warm for about 45 days, long enough to soak the ground all the way down. Long enough to drop its load of suspended mud across every inch of the field. And when the soil had drunk its fill, they opened the lower dikes and let the water drain off to the next basin downhill or back into the falling river. Then they planted. One harvest pulled out of a desert powered by nothing but gravity and timing. That's the hero of this story, not a machine, not a chemical, a field with a wall around it and the patience to wait. You could walk a modern farmer to the edge of one of those basins, and he would not believe what it was doing, because it was doing the 2 most expensive jobs in modern agriculture at the same time, for free. The first job everyone knows about. The flood carried silt, and that silt rebuilt the soil every single year. But the second job is the one that should stop you cold, because almost nobody talks about it. That 45-day soak didn't just feed the soil, it cleaned it. In hot, dry farmland, salt is a slow death sentence. Every time you irrigate, the water evaporates and leaves its dissolved salts behind in the dirt. Year after year, that salt builds up in the root zone until nothing will grow, and the land goes white and dead. It's how ancient Mesopotamia strangled itself. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon. Their fields salted up until the wheat stopped coming, and they had to switch to barley and then to nothing. They were forced to leave half their land fallow every other year just to survive it. Egypt never had that problem. The flood took care of it. That deep annual soaking pushed the accumulated salts straight down, below the reach of the roots, and flushed the soil clean. So while the great river civilizations to the east were slowly poisoning their own ground, Egypt got a complete factory reset every single autumn. No fallow years, no dead land, no salt. The river handed them a fertile, freshly rinsed field on schedule for 5,000 years running. And the people running this thing were not primitive. They were ruthless administrators. And they had turned the flood into a machine for printing money. Down on the riverbank in places like Elephantine and Cairo, they built structures called nilometers. From the outside, it looks like a religious thing, a deep stone well with a staircase running down into the water, sometimes carved with sacred inscriptions tucked inside a temple. And people will tell you it was a scientific instrument for measuring the river. That's true, but it's the least interesting thing about it. The Nilometer was a tax computer. The height of the flood told you months in advance exactly how good the harvest was going to be. A high flood meant the water reached the high ground, more land got soaked, the granaries would overflow. So the state raised the taxes to match. A low flood meant trouble, shrinking fields, hungry years. So the state cut the rates and started planning famine relief. The ideal reading was about 7 cubits, roughly 10 feet of rise. The priest would watch that water climb the stone steps day by day, and they were not praying. They were calculating your bill. This was so central to running the country that in later centuries the readings were supervised by appointed judges, specifically to stop officials from faking the numbers and skimming the difference. Tax fraud. 3,000 years before the IRS, and fewer than 24 of these structures survive today, a handful of stone wells that once turned a river's height into a number on a ledger. But here's where it gets strange, because the Egyptians didn't actually wait for the flood to predict the flood. They read it in the sky. Once a year, the brightest star in the heavens, Sirius, vanishes completely. For about 70 days, it's gone, lost in the glare of the sun, invisible from Egypt. And then, one morning, just before dawn, it claws its way back over the eastern horizon for the first time. The Egyptians watched for that exact morning, because that heliacal rising of Sirius lined up, almost to the day, with the start of the flood. So the most important event in the agricultural year wasn't announced by the river. It was announced by a star. They anchored their entire calendar to it. The reappearance of Sirius was New Year's Day, the opening of the year, the moment the whole cycle of planting and harvest and survival began again. And the detail that should put a chill down your spine is the timing of that disappearance. 70 days. The star is dead and buried below the horizon for 70 days before it's reborn into the dawn sky. That is the exact same span of time the Egyptians used to mummify their dead. 70 days between death and entombment before the soul was believed to wake into eternal life. The star died and rose. The flood died and rose. The body died and rose. The farming, the heavens, and the afterlife all ran on one synchronized clock. These people weren't farming. They were participating in a cosmology, and the basin in the dirt was where it all touched the ground. Now, you'd assume the magic ingredient in all of this was the famous silt, the black mud. And here's the twist that'll make this video smarter than every other one you'll see on the subject. The silt was overrated. I know, that's the whole legend. The rich black Nile mud, the gift of the river. But when scientists actually ran the numbers on what that sediment delivered, it was almost embarrassing. Around 88% of the silt the river carried never even landed on the fields. It shot straight past out to the sea. And what did settle out added only a few thousand tons of nitrogen, a few thousand tons of phosphorus, a little potash spread across an entire country. Trivial. Less than a modern farm dumps on a few hundred acres. So if it wasn't the chemistry, what made it work? It was everything around the mud, the salt flushing. The way the silt rebuilt the physical structure of the soil so it held water and air. The way the sediment kept building the Nile Delta out into the Mediterranean, adding new farmland at the coast. The genius of the system was never really the fertilizer in the water. It was the process, the soak, the rinse, the rest, the rhythm. And that distinction is about to matter enormously because when we replaced the system, we kept telling ourselves we could just add the silt back with a chemical bag. We were solving the wrong problem. There's one more thing about that mud, and it reframes the whole story of Egyptian power. The soil that built the pyramid's breadbasket wasn't Egyptian at all. That fertile black sediment came from more than 1,000 miles upriver, off the volcanic highlands of Ethiopia. Every summer, the monsoon rains hammer those mountains, tear loose mineral-rich volcanic soil, and the Blue Nile carries it north into Egypt. So the entire Egyptian miracle, the surpluses, the empire, the grain that fed Rome, was essentially Ethiopian dirt on loan. delivered by a river that started in someone else's country, which made Egypt fragile in a way they couldn't see. Because when something went wrong 1,000 miles away, Egypt starved. In the era of the Ptolemies, the dynasty of Cleopatra, a string of massive volcanic eruptions threw enough ash into the atmosphere to cool the planet, weaken that African monsoon, and choke off the floods. And researchers have now lined those eruption dates up against the historical record. What they found were droughts, failed harvests, and revolts. The people rose up when the river fell. A volcano they'd never heard of on the far side of the world could put a mob in the streets of Alexandria. That's how tightly this entire civilization was wired to the flood. Which brings us, finally, to the crime. For 5,000 years, this system held. It survived the Pharaohs, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans. Conquest after conquest, plague after plague, and the farming underneath it never broke. The land kept resetting, the flood kept coming. One crop a year, clean soil, no fertilizer, no exhaustion. It should have lasted forever. And then, in the 1820s, one man decided it was inefficient. His name was Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, an ambitious modernizer who wanted money and an empire of his own. And he had found his cash machine: cotton. Long staple cotton, the kind European mills were desperate for, the kind that could be sold abroad for enormous profit. There was just one problem. Cotton is a summer crop. It needs heavy, steady water through the hot months. Exactly the season when the Nile runs at its absolute lowest. The flood comes in late summer and fall. Cotton needs to be drinking all summer long. The natural rhythm of the river and the demands of the export crop did not line up at all, so he changed the river. To grow cotton for export, Egypt tore out the basin system and switched to what's called perennial irrigation, year-round water, forced across the land through a permanent network of dug canals, kept flowing even in the dry season by barrages and dams. No more single flood, soak, drain, and rest. Now the water never left. The fields could be cropped 2-3 times a year. On paper, it was a triumph. More water, more harvests, more cotton, more revenue. In reality, they had just disarmed every safety mechanism the old system was built on. Remember the salt? The flush that kept the ground clean for 5,000 years depended on the land draining and drying out between floods. Perennial irrigation never let it dry. The water table climbed and climbed. By 1908, across much of the central delta, the groundwater sat less than 3 feet below the surface. The land waterlogged. The salt, with nothing to push it down and nowhere to drain, came creeping back up toward the roots. The exact death that the basin system had held off since the time of the pyramids. The upgrade reintroduced the one problem Egypt had spent 50 centuries beating. But the salt wasn't even the worst of it. The worst of it got into people's bodies. There's a parasite that lives in the Nile, a tiny worm called schistosoma carried by a freshwater snail. It causes a disease called schistosomiasis, snail fever. It burrows in through the skin of anyone standing in still water. And it wrecks the bladder, the liver, the kidneys. And the thing that parasite needs more than anything is permanent, standing, slow-moving water for its host snail to live in. Under the old basin system, the water came and went. The fields flooded, then drained, then baked dry under the desert sun for months. The snail never got a permanent home, so the disease existed. We found its eggs in mummies 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years old, so it was always lurking. But it stayed contained. Before the switch in basin-irrigated land, infection ran at around 5% of the population. Then they filled the country with canals that never dried out. They built the snail a permanent kingdom, and the disease detonated. In the regions converted to perennial irrigation, infection rates climbed to 60% and higher. By the 1920s, an estimated 70% of Egyptian men were carrying the parasite. 70%. They had taken a contained ancient nuisance and by replumbing the entire country to grow an export crop, turned it into a national plague that hollowed out the working bodies of the people doing the farming. That is the buried headline of this entire story. We made the country sick to grow cotton. And we weren't done. In the 20th century, Egypt finished the job with the Aswan High Dam, the final, total Conquest of the flood. The dam stopped the inundation completely. No more flood, ever. And with it gone, the consequences fanned out in directions nobody had connected to a wall of concrete in the south. The silt, the few thousand tons that did matter, plus all the sediment that used to shoot out to sea, got trapped behind the dam. Roughly 100 million tons of it a year, piling up in the reservoir instead of moving downstream. The delta, which had been built and rebuilt by that sediment for thousands of years, suddenly stopped being fed and started eroding, the sea chewing back into farmland that the river used to replenish. And the fishery collapsed. This is the part almost no one sees coming because it happens hundreds of miles away from any farm. All that silt pouring into the Mediterranean had been feeding the plankton at the base of the food chain. Cut off the silt, and the plankton starved, and the fish that ate the plankton vanished. Egypt's Mediterranean catch fell from an average of 35 to 40,000 tons of fish a year down to 20,000 or less. The sardines essentially disappeared. A decision about how to water a cotton field reached all the way out into open saltwater and erased an entire fishing industry. So now you can answer the question in the title. And the answer is uglier than we found something better. We didn't. We found something more profitable in the short term for the people in charge. The basin system fed Egypt for 5,000 years without ever wearing out the soil, without salting the land, without poisoning the people, while costing essentially nothing. It was traded away deliberately for a cash crop, and the people who farmed it inherited the disease, the dead soil, and the dependence on imported fertilizer that came with the deal. And here's the final number, the one that locks the door behind us. The old system was capped. Because basin irrigation ran on gravity, you could only soak the land the rising flood actually reached. The height of the flood set a hard ceiling on how many people Egypt could feed. In the ancient world, that ceiling was somewhere between 2 million and, at the absolute most, around 12 million people. That was the limit. The river decided. We drained that river of its second chances the day we decided the wall of dirt around a flooded field wasn't worth keeping.